Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. First, I just want to say that the idea for this particular project, the seed of this project, if you will, came out of a grant from the National Endowment of the Humanities, which I was fortunate enough to receive. And it allowed me to spend time in Concord, Massachusetts, to learn about the history of Concord, which of course includes Walden. And so that sort of planted the seed about how to incorporate this idea about stewardship into NENC 1101 course. Because I've always been interested in civic engagement, but I also think that it needed a proper foundation. So how do you make civic engagement, right, service learning, meaningful? Right? How do we establish community to allow for these kinds of conversations? And so those two ideas sort of gave birth to this project, which I think of as a sort of a path to stewardship. So I have a little quick PowerPoint. I'm just going to go through, and then I guess we'll take whatever questions anyone has. So hopefully the technology will cooperate. So here we go. Okay. All right. So as I said, this is actually a photograph that I took at Walden. So from here you can actually see the pond, if you will, in the background. So a path to civic engagement. So the idea for the project was largely to make it first and foremost interdisciplinary, right? So we wanted to be able to discuss stewardship, environmental ethics, sustainability within the architecture of ENC 1101. So the aims of the project were largely to facilitate having students make the connection between sort of academic learning and establish the link, the bridge to the natural world. So from the vantage point of how is it structured, it will utilize, well, first the college, right? So we need to use the resources available that the college provides through ISID to work within the classroom, right, laying the foundation, the college, which enables us to have resources, and then to sort of inch our way into the community through ISID by working on stewardship projects in Miami-Dade County with organizations such as Urban Paradise Guild and or Hands on Miami. So in terms of the project itself, the classroom enables me to lay the foundation, right? To talk about Walden as this kind of treatise, that enables us to have that conversation from a historical standpoint that looks at Concord, Massachusetts. It looks at the transcendentalists, right? Not just Emerson, but also Thoreau and of course Margaret Fuller. And looking at them sort of lays the foundation to talk about environmental ethics, sustainability, and more importantly, when you talk about the civic engagement part, the role of the citizen. Right? So how do we sort of lay the path to that? It becomes the question. So objectively, what I wanted was to disconnect sort of those gaps that exist between academic life and real world sort of learning, sort of beyond the classroom, right? And I think that oftentimes we are so caught up in what we teach that we think about it as sort of like a kind of protective bubble. And so what the project aimed to do was to take the students beyond the classroom into the community to teach them about the role of the citizen in conjunction with ethical thinking and what is our own personal responsibility to ourselves, but also to the greater community in which we live. So as I already said, so the classroom lays the foundation, the college, or at least on my campus, for the sake of the project, I was able to utilize the environmental center, for example. So the students took a tour of the environmental center. The guide at the center talked about things like native plants, sort of keystone uh, issues, and then within the community, we sort of opened it up beyond the college, right? So the classroom, the college, and then out to the community, which again is facilitated through ISID. All right. So within the college, then. Um, the classroom obviously is first, and so if you know anything about Emerson and Thoreau, that's how we begin to have that conversation. Most of my students had never heard of Henry David Thoreau, and so in essence, everybody's starting at the same place, right? If you aren't familiar with the literature, with what he was trying to do, that sort of enables us to all be together on the same page, if you will, and establish that sort of interrelatedness, right? Nature is not just a place to find inspiration, it's a place that enables us to understand sort of the larger picture, right? And in terms of laying the historical foundation, we talk about reform movement of the 19th century, right? So this idea that we can build a better society, and Walden is the piece at the center, which allows us to facilitate not just the meditation, but also the reflection, right? So how do we coexist with nature? And Walden is central to that, because it's what allows us to have the kind of understanding that will grow the conversation. All right, so in terms of the assignments, it's all totally confined within this notion of stewardship and the citizen. So all of the essays, from the descriptive essay, which focuses on what's your Walden, right? So that is the descriptive essay. The personal experience reflective essay sort of takes a quote from Walden, which I choose, and then the students will discuss and demonstrate how the quote relates to them and sort of how they see the world around them, sort of the making those linkages. The environmental action plan is essentially a problem solution essay, but it's a little mini research project. There are requirements. The first is that the focus be a community-centered issue, right, which the students will sort of take on, and they will propose a solution to address said problem. Most of them select something within their local community. And again, it's always sort of environmentally themed. And then lastly, the opinion piece is sort of post the immersions, which I'll talk about in a second. And then students sort of talk about their environmental ethic as it existed, and then how they came to have that particular environmental ethic, right? So what is the center focus? So the stewardship projects, as I mentioned, actually took place locally, of course, through UPG, Urban Paradise Guild, and Hands on Miami. And largely what these projects had to do were restoration projects. So basic things like removing exotic species, planting, that kind of thing. So the overview at its simplest kind of looks like this, right? The classroom, the conversations that begin, the college, and sort of the resources available to our disposal, and then the two community partners, which are already partners that MDC utilizes. So objectively speaking, the project, what its focus was from the get-go was to narrow that gap between students and nature, to increase civic responsibility, of course, to establish that conversation between sort of critical and ethical thinking, and largely going back on this idea of Thoreau, to increase well-being, right? And because the students sort of took to it very well, it helped to increase retention rates, and that also proved to be quite successful. So this is actually a shot of the Walden. Okay, so I have like a quickie little film, which is a compilation of the photographs that I took on the project, and I want to share those with you momentarily. So it should work really well. Hold on one sec. Let's see. Um, okay. Okay. So, all right. So the video, the only thing that I didn't discuss that's reflected in the QuickTime video is largely that in addition to all of the things that we did, the students, I went to every single thing that the students participated in. So these were all taken from photographs that I took of the work, the immersions, and everything. And the only thing that I neglected to mention was that as part of the project, there was a relationship established with Fairchild Tropical Gardens, and that Miami-Dade College for the first time was able to participate in the Fairchild Challenge, and students submitted their essays, and they selected winners from the essays that they submitted. So the students kind of were also rewarded for the work that they did by virtue of their writing and how they spoke about the experience that they had, right? How I came to have an environmental ethic, and this is my story, and then the environmental action plan. Here's my proposal. This is what we can do about X problem. And so it was a really sort of additional little encouragement for the students. So does anybody have any questions?
Well, I have a comment. I think
Sure.
my thought was that there is still hope for us as a planet, a community. Just seeing all the young people engaging with you.
It was really surprising that like despite the fact that when they join the class, you don't know, right, the teacher is going to have us do X amount of work, but they took to it very well. They responded to it very well. They were able to articulate their experience, and they were actually able to take something from it, right? Most of the students had never been to the Everglades, for example. They had never heard of Oleta. Some of them had never been in the water. I know that sounds really strange, but several of them did comment on that to me. And only one student had actually ever been kayaking. So those were kind of really interesting responses, considering that they took to it so well. My only concern was that, I didn't want anything to happen to them, so I went on every one of these immersions, every time that we went out, I went. I wanted to ensure that nothing was going to happen to the kids, right? So that mother instinct, but there were no issues at any given point. There were no issues at all. So as I said, they enjoyed themselves, and it was sort of learning beyond the classroom because I was there with them all the time. It was sort of an extension of what we were already doing in the class. So overall, for me at least, this was a very seamless way to have a larger conversation about environmental ethics, but also to show the students that they could have these kinds of concerns here locally, right? This is how we establish community, right? You have to be involved, and you have to care about the community in which you live. It's not, Walden's Thoreau, but that doesn't mean that there aren't little Waldens in the communities in which we exist. So thank you for that. I'd like to think that they sort of maintain those ideas beyond the classroom, but even if they didn't, I think it's important to continue and to see that other people can utilize this structure to incorporate it into their ENC 1101 as well. Very seamless. So, any other questions or comments? I don't know how we're doing on.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay. I was wondering if you use plant guides or butterfly guides or bird guides or apps like iNaturalist, because when you're on the field trips, a lot, like basically the apps have progressed so much now that they literally can take a picture or something like in Everglades and then get it identified for them. So I was wondering, do they do
I love
that?
I love that app. That identifies the plants. We actually had guides for for Oleta, for the immersions at Oleta. There was a guide that did the walk, right? Told us about the plants, the properties of the plants, what was invasive, what wasn't. So we kind of got like the tour at Oleta, sort of the nature walk, if you will, prior to the kayaking. And we had the same opportunity at the Everglades, right? We had our own tour that kind of walked us through, identified plants, but we also had visuals. We had those laminated sort of fold up that identified birds for us. So students were given those for the plants as well as for the birds. Specifically in the Everglades. So that was, they were pretty excited about that, taking photos, right? And seeing alligators especially. So that was really interesting for them as well. Yeah, so is that you, Belkis? Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I just want to say that I love absolutely everything about this. I was giving people a chance. I was squirming, like trying to keep still in my seat. But I love the idea of the relevance. I love the idea of connecting these classics, right? These kind of pieces that feel disconnected, and making them so relevant, so accessible to students. I love the idea of showcasing the work, and I think so many of us. And it took me such a long time to realize that I was, putting all these things up on, and this is in my K through 12 years, right? Putting all this stuff up in my boards and in the, and putting them even in the hallways and in the library, but then they weren't really getting outside of the walls of the school anyway, right? They really weren't getting outside of the campus anyway. And so the idea of having them contribute to these contests and be validated and to have them, have that, the power of their words and their experience and sharing their voice reinforced by an external community, by external factors. I think that's so brilliant. So I just want to say that I absolutely love the way that, it's interesting how this full package is like the quintessential awesome lesson, right? And it's funny because you said, or I think I heard you say something like, I don't know if they're going to remember this, or I know it's going to be unforgettable for them. And that's what we hope for, right? When we talk about learning, right? We talk about learning for change, like learning should change you. It should be something that you take with you forever. And I guarantee that as it has happened, that it's happened with me and you and our relationship. I'm a guarantee that 5, 10 years, 20 years, when you see these students again, they will remember, oh my God, remember when we went to Fairchild and when we went kayaking, and especially those first time experiences are so powerful. So thank you so much for doing this. And I think it's wonderful to establish those kinds of connections beyond, again, the classroom and to the real world, and connect the old with the new and with our place in society and how we can contribute. So thank you for all of it.
Oh, no problem, no problem. Thank you for understanding what I was trying to do. That's exactly it. The idea that Walden is as relevant today as it was when it was written, right? And to have it be the centerpiece for having this question and this discussion about where we are today with sustainability and environmental issues and really environmental ethics that our students sadly haven't grown up with, right? So to actually have these conversations now for a lot of them was really quite the realization, right? Like, oh my gosh, no, I never thought about that. No, I didn't grow up like that, right? Those kinds of things. And I think, and it was eye-opening from the stories that they told and the kinds of things that they wrote about. It was clear that the experience was meaningful, and so I do hope, that they kind of carry that little light with them into the future, right? Into other classes, into what they're going to do, career-wise, right? All those things. We can only hope, right, that it's meaningful in that regard as well. So overall, yes, I enjoyed the project. I'm not gonna lie to you, it's very time consuming, largely because I couldn't take all the students at once. So for example, with the visits to Oleta, right, you have to, kind of half the class, you take, X amount of students one Saturday, and then the next Saturday, and then there's the Everglades, and it's the same thing, it's constant. So a lot of Saturdays and Sundays were spent working on the project. But hey, they showed up bright and early, and so it made me feel hopeful. I can say that, and it's true. So, anybody else have any questions or comments?
If there are no more questions, then may we adjourn? Call the session.
Oh yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Sandra.
Thank you very much.
And thanks to all of the attendees. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to reach out for this. I'm going to reach out to get ideas and to see how you establish all those partnerships. And I'm sure did you work with other professors? I'm sorry. And I know I'm sorry.
I did. I only worked with one other professor, Jose Gunton. He is a psychology professor that worked with me. He was looking at all of these things from a psychological perspective. So it wasn't just my students, it was his students as well. And so in essence, it was a different approach, looking at the same text, looking at the same field trips, but talking about it from the vantage point of transpersonal psychology. So,
love it. I love that you worked across disciplines and collaborated with other faculty members. I mean, that's awesome also. So thank you. I will be reaching out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.